Welcome to LFPL's At the Library series, an ongoing podcast featuring author talks, programs, and events at the Louisville Free Public Library. For more information about upcoming events, visit us online at www.lfpl.org/upcoming-events.htm.
Geraldine Brooks grew up in the western suburbs of Sydney. She worked as a reporter for the Sydney Morning Herald and the Wall Street Journal, where she covered crises in the Middle East, Africa, and the Balkans. In 1990, with her husband, Tony Horwitz, she won the Overseas Press Club Award for Best Coverage of the Gulf War. The following year, they received a citation for excellence for their series War and Peace. And in 2006, she was awarded the Pulitzer Prize in Fiction for her novel March. Her novels People of the Book, Caleb's Crossing, and The Secret Chord were all New York Times bestsellers. And her first novel, Year of Wonders, is an international bestseller, translated into more than 25 languages. Her latest novel, Horse, is based on the remarkable true story of the record-breaking thoroughbred Lexington. Please join me in welcoming Geraldine Brooks to Louisville.
Well, good day, all y'all. Seeing it's Bloomsday, I thought I'd start with a lengthy reading from Ulysses. Just kidding. We're not going to do that, although it is Bloomsday. Happy Bloomsday. I just wanted to ask if if you could put your hand up, anyone in this room who is connected with a horse in any way. Oh boy. Okay, then this is going to be great, because how many of those who put their hand up believe that there's such a thing as a free horse? Good. That is something I did not know, but I know now, and I'm going to tell you all about it. So I thought before I launched into talking about the book Horse, I would go back in time a little bit and tell you about my history with horses, which is really the story of how I came to write this book. Then I'll tell you a little bit about the book, and then I might read a page or two, maybe. But then I hope we'll have a discussion. So don't be intimidated by having to get up and go to a microphone, because I find that the questions is the time when I find out what you really want to know, and it's often the best part of the evening. Certainly more fun for me than hearing myself blather on. So, without further ado, my story with horses goes back, I think, to when I was 8 years old, and I went to visit my dad at his place of work. I'd never been there before, but we were in the city, and my mother said, let's go and see where your father works. And he, at that time, was working as a proofreader at the city newspaper. And we arrived there just as the afternoon edition was going to press. And so he took me down to the press floor. And I'll never forget it. It was this vast space with the gigantic rolls of newsprint, and the air smelled of ink, and it was kind of misty with the ink. And then the presses started to roll, and the newsprint was sailing across the room in a blur. And eventually the papers started landing on the conveyor belt, and he reached out and he grabbed one and he handed it to me, and it was warm. It was hot off the presses. And I looked down and I read the headline, and I thought, I am the first person in the city who knows what's going on here this afternoon. And from that moment on, I really wanted to be a journalist. And so I directed all my attention to thinking about what you needed to be good at to be a journalist. And so by the time I got to college, I had read the papers enough to know that politics was a really big part of what journalists did. So I enrolled as a government major. But I thought if they didn't want me covering politics, there was a lot of cultural coverage in the paper. So my other major was fine arts. And 4 years later, I graduated, and I could tell you all about classical political theory from Plato to Hobbes, and the structure of a bicameral parliament, and the uses of tempera in Quattrocento Italian wall painting and the role of the subconscious in the work of Kandinsky. And I thought I was in pretty good shape, and sure enough, the newspaper hired me, and they sent me to the sports department. And my job in the sports department was to be the assistant to the racing writers, which meant I had to go to every race meeting in Sydney and take down details of every horse. And I can tell you that is a lot of nags, because Australians are pretty obsessed with horse racing. So it was an exhausting job, because you would go from one race meeting to the next, and on some days you would go from the gallops to the trots at night. And at the end of the night, you had to go back to the newspaper and look at the first edition to make sure that there were no errors in it. Because unbelievably, it makes me feel like I lived when dinosaurs walked the earth, but rural bookmakers paid out on the results that appeared in the first edition of the Sydney Morning Herald. So if I had made a mistake, I would be terminated, and not just from the Herald. So it was good training in being very accurate, because my job was to keep a record of every horse, their condition, where they were at the turn, where they were at the finish, what the odds started at, what they went out to. So it's reams and reams of information and numbers. And I did that job for 4 months, and I was really tired and very stressed. And I was also very distressed, because going to every race meeting, you see a lot of accidents on the track. And I was just, as an animal lover, just beside myself at the terrible injuries that happened to these racehorses. So I had PTSD from the animal welfare and from my experience as a racing reporter, because the other thing that happened was I was the only woman in the sports department in those days, and this was before there was a sexual harassment policy. So anyway, I ran 100 miles away from horses after that, and I didn't really think about them again in any kind of serious way until 2011, and I was at a writer's retreat at a genteelly shabby ranch in Santa Fe. And my room at this ranch was overlooking the horse corrals, and the horse corrals were full of absolutely beautiful Appaloosas and paints and quarter horses. And I was draped over the rails admiring these gorgeous creatures when the equally gorgeous Cherokee Wrangler ambled over and said, "You like horses, you should come on a trail ride." And I said, "I can't ride, I've never ridden." And he said, "Don't worry about that. These horses know their jobs. They won't let you fall." So the next day, I'm following behind him through the pink arroyos of the New Mexico desert, and I am ecstatic. This is wonderful. The horse is so sure-footed, and it's a beautiful way to see the country, and I feel this kind of connection with this lovely, lovely animal. And then the Cherokee guide says, "We're going to pick up a canter." And we did. And it was fabulous. And I thought, nothing to it, Great. I went home, and I'm still in this euphoric state. And a young friend comes over for dinner, and I'm telling her all about how great it was. And she looks out the window and she says, "You've got a couple of acres here. You could have a horse. In fact, you could have my horse." She was living in, she said, I've just been really worried about, I can't keep her, and I was worried about her, and I think it'd be great. A free horse. Well, the first thing that I had to do was fence half my property and convert my tool shed into a stable. And the next thing I had to do was figure out how you transport a horse, because this horse was not close by. This horse was in Mexico. my friend had been running a restaurant in San Miguel Allende, and she was a young woman, and she was a bit tired of that gig after 5 years. And so now that she'd found a home for her horse, she had nothing stopping her getting out of the restaurant and going on to her next adventure. But it's not easy to bring a horse from Mexico, as I learned. You've got two governments, you've got a volatile border, you've got all kinds of issues, plus you have to get the right kind of transport with the springy floor and the whole deal. So while that was happening, I decided I better take some riding lessons. And I did, and that went really well, except for the first lesson when, I had called up and they said, sure, come over, and they put me on this lovely horse that didn't look too big when the little girl was warming her up for me. But once I got on, I realized the ground was very far away. And there was a sign on the wall that said, an equine professional is not responsible for the injury or death of a participant. And I thought, is this really a good idea for a 53-year-old new activity? Shouldn't I have taken up knitting? Anyway, I'm walking around, it's all going well, and then the instructor says, now I'd like you to pick up a trot. And how you do that, this horse is very well trained, just brush his sides. So I brushed his sides, and whoosh, we were off. It was like being on a piston. This horse was very well trained. He was a former Grand Prix dressage champion named Chardon L. von Bolchak. Anyway, so that was my first lesson. When I came for my second lesson, there was a little Welsh cob pony. Because the equine professional had noted that I was about the size of an average 12-year-old, and so I could start on a pony, which was great. Anyway, eventually this horse arrived from Mexico, and she was absolutely beautiful. She was a Palomino quarter horse, and Katie came over and showed my son how to ride her bareback, and this is terrific. So after the horse had rested for a couple of days, I thought, I'm going to go on a trail ride. And so I saddled her up, and we took off, and 2 minutes later I was riding underneath her belly because I hadn't readjusted the girth. And I now know that God really does love stupid people, because I took this horse alone into dense Massachusetts woods, this horse from the Altiplano, who had never seen anything like this before. And now I know that the spinning ears and the heavy breathing was her terror. And the only thing that got us home in one piece was that I was still in that euphoric state from Santa Fe. And so she probably thought, if my rider is this relaxed, it must be okay. But it didn't take her long to figure out I didn't have a clue. And when Massachusetts winter hit, this fine-coated horse who'd never really had a severe winter was in a really foul mood. And then, I was having a riding lesson in the backyard, and she bucked me off, and no amount of grabbing manes was going to save me. So I hit the hard ground, and my instructor comes over and says, we usually try to get back on. And I looked up from the ground and said, yes, I will. And she said, but you have to stand up first. And that proved a problem. So as well as learning all the stuff I now know about hocks and fetlocks, I also know that there's a bone in the pelvis called a superior remus, because I'd broken mine. Anyway, when I got off the crutches, we went back to riding lessons, and I got the horse master, and I got the saddle fitter, I got the new farrier, I got the supplements. And my free horse, if you count the orthopedist bills and the transport, is now edging up more like $20,000. Anyway, so we went on, but eventually I realized that I think the term of art is over-mounted. And this Western-style ranch horse who'd grown up on a ranch being ridden by cowboys and then by my friend Katie, who was fearless and expert, really needed a better rider. So she went off to the Cape to live with a young girl who was an expert rider, and together they won the barrel racing championships in Connecticut. So that was good. And I didn't have a horse for a while. And then somebody said to me, "Are you ever going to get another horse?" And I said, "I will if I could find one that's close to the ground and doesn't buck." And they said, "You want Valentine." And I actually paid for Valentine, and it was money well spent. But how did this lead to the most famous racehorse stud sire in Kentucky? Well, as you know, once you get horse crazy, there's no going back. And all I wanted to do in this period of my life was be with my horse, think about horses, read about horses. And I was getting absolutely no work done on anything else. And just at that moment, when the red ink was about to overflow the balance sheet, I was invited to lunch at Plymouth Plantation, which is a living history museum in Massachusetts. And it was a donor lunch, so I thought I was just supposed to be there to sit next to a donor and talk up the museum, how great it was and what a research asset. But it turned out that they had another reason for inviting me there, which was they'd just read my book, Caleb's Crossing, that had come out. And so they had this brilliant idea that they were going to pitch me a novel about a young woman from the Plymouth Plantation that they had a lot of historical information on. And there's only one problem with this rather good idea, which was that was exactly the character in Caleb's Crossing. And so I wasn't about to turn around and write the same book again, so I'm picking up my salad and nodding politely, when across the table I start hearing fragments of another conversation, and it is an official from the Smithsonian Museum in Washington regaling his luncheon companion about how he had just delivered the skeleton of this famous racehorse from the Museum of Natural History's attic to pride of place in a new display at the International Museum of the Horse in Lexington. And I heard him talking about how this horse was fantastically fast, and he became such an obsession to people that they had to invent a mass-produced stopwatch so everybody could clock his times, and how he was, what happened to him in the Civil War. And when they got up to the Civil War story, I turned to my companion and said, "Could you just pipe down about that Puritan girl for a minute, because I just need to hear about this racehorse." And by the end of that lunch, I knew that this was a wonderful story, and it was a story I wanted to tell, and also it was going to save the solvency of my family, because now I could work on the thing that I was obsessed about and call it research. And my publisher agreed to support this project. But I didn't really know what I was getting into. I thought I would be writing the fantastic story of a brilliant horse, with all the twists and turns that many of you know about, how his racing career was cut short by the blindness that he suffered, but how he went on to have a wonderful second career as his great stud sire. And I thought, that's enough. There's a novel. But the minute I started researching it, I realized that the history of the Black Horseman was such a part of his story that I would have to go in that direction too. And he, having been trained by Harry Lewis, a great black trainer who had bought his freedom, and then many accounts in letters referring to Lexington being taken from Natchez to New Orleans by a darky, and references to a groom called Jarrett, but not a lot of detail about who Jarrett was. So I started to realize that this story would have to be the story of the Black Horseman who cared for Lexington, as well as the story of the racehorse. And then I found out about the painter, Thomas Scott, and that whole other direction opened up in the novel, because Thomas Scott, an itinerant horse painter, did many portraits of Lexington, and one of the one that everybody described as his best painting is missing. And that is a painting of Lexington in his old age being led out by Black Jarrett, his groom. So here was Jarrett again. And when I went to the Smithsonian to find out about the history of the skeleton and the science that is done there on bones, I also saw a painting of Lexington that is in the Smithsonian collection, and it's by Thomas Scott. It's of Lexington as a younger horse, and it came to the Smithsonian in a bequest that it was the only 19th century realist painting in this bequest. Everything else was edgy contemporary art, and it was a bequest from a gallerist called Martha Jackson, who was a pioneering feminist gallery owner in New York City in the post-World War II period. She was a champion of the new art movements that were changing our aesthetics. She worked closely with Pollock and de Kooning and Bridget Riley, and those were the paintings she'd given the Smithsonian, except for this one painting of Lexington. Why did she have that one painting? That fascinated me, so I knew that the story was going to go there as well. And so I had my work cut out for me, and that's the book is a braided narrative set in these 3 time periods. So it's the story of Lexington in the 1850s and 60s. It's the story of Martha Jackson in the 1950s, and it's a contemporary story at the modern-day Smithsonian. Because one thing I realized was if I was going to be writing a contemporary story, and I wanted to, because I love to get into the intricacies of what happens behind the scenes in museums and the scientific work and the artwork that goes on. So I knew that I would have to bring the story of race out of the 19th century and into the present day, because it is a story that continues until the present day. So that's a bit about the book and a bit about how I came to write it. So I'm just going to read you a very short excerpt to just give you a sense of how I'm trying to tell the story. And I forgot to put a bookmark in here, so just bear with me for a minute. Okay, so the bit I want to read you is when Thomas Scott comes to the Meadows, Dr. Elisha Warfield's estate, to paint a horse for him, and he meets Jarrett. Later that day, when Jarrett was seeing to the paddock picking, he noticed Scott, his lanky frame draped over the stone wall, watching the 4-year-old named Glacier. Glacier was grazing in the largest turnout, the one that ran down from the home pasture to the creek edge through some stands of white oak. And it took Jarrett quite a time to pick it clean, since he was particular. He didn't mind even this lowly job. It was one way to keep track of the health of the horses. He'd saved a horse from colic once by noticing the state of its droppings. He'd been at it for a good half hour before Scott finally drew out a small sketch pad. Jarrett was powerfully curious to get a glimpse, so he began working his way over towards the wall. When Scott straightened and stretched, he noticed Jarrett and beckoned him over. Jarrett wheeled his barrow closer. "What's he like?" Scott asked, tilting his head in the direction of the horse. Jarrett averted his eyes and scuffed the turf with the toe of his boot. It wasn't a good idea to speak without putting a deal of thought into it. Words could be snares. Less of them you laid out there, less likely they could trap you up. "Collected at the post, fast off the start." "No," said Scott, and Jarrett winced. There you go, less than a dozen words, and he'd said the wrong ones, seemingly. But then Scott spoke less sharply. "I meant, what's he like? Busy mind or a dreamer? Bossy or well-mannered? I want to know how he feels about the world, what kind of soul he's got." Jarrett had never heard horses spoken of in that way. although it was how he thought of them in his own mind. His father knew all about how to make a horse work its best, and there was a great deal of learning to that. Dr. Warfield was a shrewd judge of when to buy and sell them, but Jarrett thought both his father and Dr. Warfield treated horses like mechanical contraptions. Do this, get that. Jarrett disagreed, but had never said so. To speak of horses as beings with feelings, even souls, it might seem like foolishness or even maybe sinful in the eyes of the angry God of the white church Dr. Warfield attended. But now this man was speaking as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Jarrett tried for the first time to put his thoughts into words. Glacier, well, he'd be a fly one, he said shyly. Fly, what's that mean? Asked Scott. We don't have that expression where I'm from, back east. Jarrett tried to think how to explain it. Fly means smart, but quiet about it, not a know-it-all. Not cunning neither, because that's like being crooked, and Glacier's not that way. He's a thinker, and that's good, on account of he won't do the stupid thing like getting a hoof caught in a hole or shying if a bird breaks out of a bush. But it's bad, too, because he's not about to do what you say just because you say it. He'd take his own time to think for himself. Not all jockeys can see why a horse might be that way, so I think that how he does on the track always going to depend on who's asked him to do it. You see now? See how his tail swings side to side? He knows how to use himself, but he don't always engage that big hind end when he's in a race. You have to know to ask him just the right way. And then back home in the paddock, he's not one to try and be the boss horse. He don't barge in to get the feed so as to rile the others, but he don't go hungry neither. He watch and he think, and when the others commence to fussing for one particular flake of hay, he go off and find one that he can eat by his own self without aggravation. That's Fly. Jarrett took a breath. He wasn't sure he'd ever said so many words in a row before. But then no one had ever seemed so ready to hear his opinion. Scott was smiling. Thank you, that helps me a good deal in thinking how to paint him. Jarrett wasn't in that habit of questioning his seniors, especially white people. They didn't tend to appreciate it. But he was powerfully curious. How do it do that? Scott smiled. Why do you think men like these thoroughbreds so much? Money, I guess, Jarrett replied. Well, sometimes they make money, but hardly ever nearly enough to make up for what most folks spend on them. So there's got to be something more. They're beautiful. Of course, they are beautiful, and men with money like to have beautiful things. Beautiful estates, beautiful wives. Scott smiled. But I can tell you, and it's a fact, many a horse-owning gentleman will pay me $50 or $60 for a painting of his horse, but he'd grudge to spend half that on a portrait of his wife, no matter how beautiful she might be. Jarrett kicked the dirt. Then maybe it's the races. Folk get excited to go there, all kinds of folk, high and low. Scott nodded. All men are equal on the turf or under it, that's the saying. But the folk who own the horses, it's much more for them than an exciting day out. Here's the ground of it as I see it. A racehorse is a mirror, and a man sees his own reflection there. He wants to think he's from the best breeding. He wants to think himself brave. Can he win against all comers? And if not, does he have self-mastery to take the loss, stay cool in defeat, and try again undaunted? Those are the qualities of a great racehorse and a great gentleman. A gentleman likes to have a horse that gives the right answers to those questions. Then he can believe he will give the right answers too. To do my part, I have to give the man a likeness that shows not just how beautiful the horse looks, but how beautiful it feels to him. Scott's words struck Jarrett like a bell clapper, and the truth of it rang through him. Maybe you don't need to be no gentleman to feel like that, he said. That Dali fall, he makes me feel hopeful, like the future going to matter more than it did the day before he come. Scott nodded. I can see that. A new horse is all promise. The two stood in companionable silence, both gazing as Glacier cropped the lush spring grass. And then I just want to read a little tiny bit more. When he starts to paint, and he asks Jarrett to assist him. So that was the first time, but not the last, that Jarrett held a horse as Scott took meticulous measurements of every bone and joint. Then Jarrett groomed Glacier, carrying his coat till it gleamed like the ice he was named for. Later, he stood by and watched as Scott unrolled the bolt of Irish flax, fixed it to a stretcher, and propped it on his easel. He knelt down to sketch. A horse presents better from a low-angled view, he explained. You want to be looking up at them a little bit, not dead on level. Jarrett was amazed as Scott's hand moved swiftly, filling the white ground with assured strokes. He sketched the horse as if he could see right inside to the bones and muscle. When Scott stood up to stretch and to consider the charcoal lines he'd made, Jarrett risked a question. You learn that, muscles and such, from your time doctoring? I learned it from my time butchering. I worked at the Philadelphia knackery for 6 months, carving up horse carcasses till I couldn't lift a paintbrush. But by the end of it, I'd learned the nature of every bone and sinew in a horse. Scott picked up his palette then and squeezed out a dozen small knobs of colour. Jarrett observed the bright spectrum formed on that ordinary piece of board, from warm shades to cool. Scott named each pigment as he coaxed the shiny worms of paint from their tubes, and Jarrett learned the unfamiliar names. The burnt sienna that he'd thought of as mere brown, the French ultramarine that he'd known simply as blue. But blue wasn't so simple to Scott. He had Prussian blue, cerulean, cobalt, teal, navy, so many complicated words for a simple thing. Jarrett knew the names for horse colors, bay, blood bay, buckskin, dun, roan, but now it seemed like every other thing was just as various if you troubled to look at it closely. Jarrett's task was to keep the horse's attention, rustling a pail of grain or whistling. What you want is tension, Scott explained. A horse shows best with a bend in the neck. He looks more agile, more elegant. Scott filled his hand with 6 or 8 different brushes, and Jarrett wondered why so many until he figured it. 1 brush for each small puddle of colour, to keep each tone clean and pure, unmuddied with another. He saw how Scott worked on the whole painting, not just a corner of it, dabbing here, there, farther down, nose, back, tail, change brush, new colour, hocks, mane, haunches, change brush, new colour, hoof, poll, withers, change brush, new colour. Jarrett had thought of the paintings on the walls up in the Warfield house as flat things. Now he understood that they weren't flat at all, but built up in many layers, just like a stone wall. He learned that shadows weren't black or brown, but richly coloured by the lilac-toned light or the greens reflected off the grass. He saw how, for Glacier's white coat, Scott used barely any white at all, but pinks and mauves and lively greys in pale washes, layer after layer. Yet in the end, a white horse stood there, Glacier, looking fly. I'm buzzing. So I would love to know if you have any questions at all about this book, the research for it, any other book, or any just general questions, comments, abuse.
Hi, this is so exciting. I can't wait to go home and read it. I have a question. Just as your research has brought you into mid-19th century Kentucky, what were some of the most surprising or interesting things that you learned, and maybe talk about some of the research resources that you relied on, simply because there's a lot of material, but then again, there's not, especially when you're talking about the Black groomsmen and jockeys and horsemen.
That is so true. So yes, the lucky thing is Keeneland Library. They are so helpful. That was absolutely wonderful. And Lexington himself is so well documented. So I know the details of every race he ran in granular detail. I know all about his food preferences, so all that, I know about his last illness. It's all there because people love this horse so much and there's so much interest in it. And the newspapers, there was at least 3 high circulation racing papers that covered every twist and turn. And in those papers, too, you can find some information about the black jockeys because they were of interest to the white readership. You can find a lot of very distressing racist stereotypes as well in those papers. But so the research, I obviously came back here, dug deep into those archives, and then into the letters that still exist that are kept in the Beinecke. There's a great collection there at Yale. And in the letters, there are references to different black horsemen from different racing stables. At Woodburn, where Lexington spent his stud career, there were 2 extraordinary black horsemen. Ansel Williams was in charge of the operations, the thoroughbred operations there. And we know some things about him. We know some things about Harry Lewis, who was the initial trainer of Lexington. But it's not a lot. It's not a lot about what their lives or actually their day-to-day was like. There is one oral history, Charles Stewart, but he was talking to a white woman whose family had formerly enslaved him. So you have to take it with a grain of salt about how forthcoming he can be, or whether he's just being tactful, So you eke out what you can, and then you go and rest on the work of historians, many of them black historians, who've done great work on ordinary domestic life of enslaved people, so you can get a sense of the material circumstances. The wonderful book on slave marriage by Tara Hunter, who's from Princeton, and she looks at the difficulties of being in love and trying to have a family when your family could be ripped apart at any moment. And she has gone into great detail in that research. So that's what you use, and you kind of, a little bit like Thomas Scott, layer by layer, you try and build up a picture. And what you're doing is just saying it might have been like this. This is my imaginative empathy applied to as much work as I can do in the archives. And when the archives fall silent, then we have to start to make inferences from what else we know. But what surprised me the most, the thing that surprised me first was what racing was like. Because this was not the sprints that I had covered for the Sydney Morning Herald. These, races that often aren't even a mile long, and the Kentucky Derby is considered a long race at a mile and a quarter. These were 4 miles, and the horses would run 4 miles 3 times in one day. So it's a very different style of racing and a very different kind of horse that can do it. And you imagine the tactics that the jockeys have to be able to employ during a 4-mile race. And then you understand why people loved this so much, because it must have been so much more exciting if you went to one of these great contests and you would see your favorite horse run that distance 4 times in the same day. I mean, it's riveting. It's like a story every time you go to a race. So that was surprising to me. The other thing that was surprising to me was that there's a connection between Jackson Pollock and Lexington. But when I discovered that, it was too good to leave out. But I'll let you read the book in order to find out what that connection is. Other things that surprised me, yeah. Well, those are the main ones. I love the detail that Gordon Burnett found a picture by Thomas Scott in his neighbor's trash pile, and that was how Scott was rediscovered and reappreciated. So, yeah, I went to see Ginny Lacer, and she shared her research into Thomas Scott with me. So it was absolutely wonderful to people here. As you know, this is an incredibly open and friendly community, and everybody was extremely helpful to this girl from Australia who's writing about their horse. More questions?
So I'm from here, and I'm a boomeranger, and it's difficult to talk about horse racing in the thoroughbred racing industry in any way but, what hat are you going to wear, and da-da-da-da. But I grew up with a father who gambled a lot at the track and was an owner of horse races, and it just didn't appeal to me. And it seemed, I wanted to ask you how you felt about the ethics of the industry, if you don't mind.
Yeah, no, I don't mind at all.
And not only the treatment of the horses, but of the people that work on the backside and things like that. I'd just love to hear your point of view.
Yeah, well, thank you for that. And I do try and, the novel goes there because I do think that the way we use thoroughbreds is really, it's so unfair to the horse to ask them to run so hard when they're babies. And, when you have a horse yourself, you don't even start really riding them till they're 5. And most of the thoroughbreds who don't make it as racehorses are over and done with at 5, and not a lot of them can make the transition to other disciplines because they've been trained to go flat out in one direction, and they haven't been socialized in the normal way, and just so many of these gorgeous animals are just wasted and thrown away. Now, my pony, Valentine, her paddock mate belongs to my next door neighbor. And her paddock mate is an off-the-track thoroughbred, and his name is Screaming Hot Wings. And he is 33 years old. And he is still sound as a bell. In fact, he still likes to jump. And to me, that just shows what a waste so much of racing is, because you've got this wonderful animal who's given so much, he's still giving. And, my neighbor says it's the longest relationship of her adult life. But, when she got him, he was 5 years old, and he was one of the lucky ones who found another job. He loved to jump, and they were eventers for many years until, they both grew out of it, basically. And now he's a trail horse, and sometimes he schools kids, and is very generous about helping little people learn how to ride. So I would just say, it would be great if we could make a better plan for these horses, and if we could stop pumping them full of Lasix and making them do something they're not really designed to do, which makes them more injury prone. So, yeah. Sorry, and you asked me about the laborers on the backstretch, and I'm not an expert at that, but what I learned when I was around the track in Sydney was they are the most exploited class of people, and they work incredible hours for very little pay, and mostly they do it because they just love horses so much. So, yeah. Sorry.
So my question had to do with historical fiction, sort of as a genre, and I come at being interested in your book from the horse racing industry. I came out of that. I also own an off-track racehorse that I adopted. She was my pandemic adoption. But in the realm of historic fiction, a lot of times it's there's an era or an event, but the characters are wildly fictional. There's very little bearing. It's more the background that's a historical fiction. Just in hearing you talk tonight, it sounds like you're working with the actual characters of that period. So just talk a little bit about the range and where you are on that scale of, it sounds like yours would be nonfiction if it were not for you having to fill in some of the blanks of the early history that just doesn't exist.
That's exactly right. So that's where I know I've got a subject for me. Because if you can know everything, then it's a subject for a narrative historian who can, write a engaging and entirely factual account. And initially, when I came across the story of Lexington, to be honest, I thought I'd found a great story for my husband, Tony Horwitz, because he writes nonfiction and he loves this period so much and he loves Kentucky so much. And I thought, I've got a big present for my husband. Here it is. But then he looked into it and he found that there were all the gaps about the Black Horseman's life stories. And then we realized that the only way to engage with it would be fictional. But my approach is always follow the line of fact as far as you can, because that's the best stuff. And if you come to read this book, anything that seems unlikely, those are the true things. Because Mark Twain said, fiction is obliged to stick to possibilities. Truth isn't. So you're crazy if you don't mine the record for everything that you can get out of it, all the details of the characters. And and the characters in this story are so rich. I mean, the white characters that we do know a lot about. I mean, Richard Tenbrook, you could not make him up. This is the guy who led the syndicate that bought Lexington and took the horse to first to Natchez and then to New Orleans, and was the impresario of all the great match races and the race against time when Lexington was racing against a stopwatch, essentially. And he was such a fascinating character, made his fortune as a riverboat gambler. And then after his time with Lexington, he went to England and took American thoroughbreds and had some success there and was palling around with the Prince of Wales and was very beloved by the British aristocracy, and lost a fortune and came home and died penniless. The guy who found his dead body was actually coming because the last thing that Ten Brock had of any value were his racing trophies, and he was trying to sell them. So it's a real story arc that goes beyond the scope of the novel, because he let Lexington go off to Alexander's Woodburn stud. So, yeah. Does that answer the... Yeah?
Your writing and knowledge are so broad, it just baffles me. My favorite books of yours are Secret Chord, 9 Parts of Desire, People of the Books, my favorite. Read it twice. So I guess my question is, horses, the Middle East, Judaica, the Bible, Puritan women, plagues. What's your next act?
If I say all of the above, it won't be untrue. I'm not really ready to talk about it because it's a ways off, because I'm going to write a small nonfiction book next. And but the next novel spans a very long period of time, shall we say. And I'm just going to have to leave it there right now. Anybody else?
People of the Book was also my favorite. I've read that a couple times. I'm wondering where your inspiration came from for that.
People of the Book?
Yes.
Oh, thank you for asking that, because, Ernest Hemingway said a great thing about ideas for novels. He said, an idea for a novel can be something you're lucky enough to overhear, or it can be the wreck of your whole damn life. And it's lucky for me, it tends to be something I overhear at a lunch. But in the case of People of the Book, it was something I think Hemingway would have approved of, because it was something I overheard in a bar. And in a bar in a war zone. And I was reporting for the Wall Street Journal at the time, and I was covering the UN. And so I had gone to Sarajevo in the middle of the siege of the city to report on what the UN was and was not doing in Sarajevo. And it was an incredibly tough time there, because that war, even by the harsh yardstick of wars, was really bad because it was a war against civilians, and it was a war against the idea of a multi-ethnic community. And so if you're making war against an idea, you have to not only kill the people, but you have to destroy any record that those people lived harmoniously together. So a lot of the shelling targeted libraries and targeted museums. And there was only one functioning hotel at the time in Sarajevo, rather inaptly named, given the circumstances, the Holiday Inn. So that was where all the journalists stayed. And if you checked into the Holiday Inn, you didn't ask for a room with a view, because if you could see the beautiful mountains that rise like a bowl all around the city of Sarajevo, the snipers and the artillerymen on those mountains could see you. And almost every window in the Holiday Inn had been blown out, and everybody slept in the stairwell kind of thing. But the bar worked. And sometimes they even had ice, and I don't know how they did that because the power didn't work very often. But anyway, you go out and you do this harrowing reporting, and then we'd all, drift to the bar. And one night the talk turned to this missing treasure from the museum, which was just across the road and had been the subject of heavy, heavy shelling. And there was a terrific reporter from the BBC there. She was really something. You didn't want to get on the wrong side of her. And she was really upset one morning because they'd been shelling really hard. And so she asked to be taken across the lines over to the Serbian side because she wanted to confront the artillery commander. And she went and said, "Why are you shelling the Holiday Inn? You know that there are only foreign journalists staying there." And the artillery commander, she was pretty formidable, said, "Oh, sorry, we disturbed you. We weren't aiming for the Holiday Inn. We were aiming for the museum." So that was how that was. But anyway, the talk was about this missing treasure of the museum, which was this Hebrew codex that was gloriously illuminated and very rare and had been created in Spain at the time of Convivencia and had made its way to Sarajevo after all kinds of perils, having almost been burned in the Inquisition and other things, and had been saved from the Nazis by a heroic Muslim librarian who spirited it out under the nose of the Nazi looters and hidden it in a mosque. And now it was gone, and some people said they knew for certain that the Israelis had come and taken it out through a tunnel under the airport and taken it to safety in Israel, and others said, no, that's not what happened to it. It was sold on the black market to buy weapons for the Bosnian side. And I thought, this is interesting, I should look into it. But by the time I got around to thinking about it again, it was revealed what had happened. And again, a Muslim librarian had risked his life to save a Jewish book and had gone in under shelling and cracked the safe that it was in and taken it and hidden it. And at the end of the war, he presented it to the Jewish community for their Passover celebration. So that was what got me going. I loved the story of how in this, we as human beings seem to succumb to this terrible disease every generation or two of demonizing the other, that anyone who's not exactly like us is somehow less than. And in every time this rises up, it destroys something really good. Like in Spain, Convivencia was a flowering of art and literature, and I don't think Spain ever recovered when they kicked out the Muslims and the Jews. And then, the same thing, the incredible culture of Germany that turned to Nazism, and then Sarajevo, this multi-ethnic society that was shattered by the ethnic cleansing idea. And so I think what's the only hope that I take from any of this is that always there are a few individuals who are brave enough to stand up and say, no, this is not right. We've got more that unites us than divides us. And those are the people that saved that book. So.
What did it feel like when you got the call that you won the Pulitzer Prize?
It felt fabulous. But it took a few minutes for it to feel fabulous because I didn't believe it. So what happened was, it was a year that I had a fellowship at Harvard, so I wasn't at home. We'd moved to Cambridge for the year, and it was the first day of my son's spring break from school, and he was about 8 at the time, and he at that time liked painting these little figurines called Warhammers, and so we were busy painting these little figurines, and it's a few minutes past 3 o'clock, and the phone rings. And it was my old editor from the Wall Street Journal. And he's incoherent. He's like, "This is so great. This is so fantastic. You're really wonderful." And I thought, oh, Ken's been out to another long lunch. And he said, Don't you know you just won the Pulitzer Prize? And I said, "Don't be ridiculous. I can't have won the Pulitzer Prize. I haven't done any journalism." And he said, "You got it for your novel, you Burke." And I still didn't believe him because my novel was called March. And that same year, E.L. Doctorow had a novel called The March. And I thought, he's got it mixed up with the Doctorow book. And I hung up on him. And the phone immediately rang again. And it was my father-in-law, who never goes for a long lunch. He was a neurosurgeon, so I knew he was stone cold sober, and also he was a guy who cared a lot about accuracy. And a friend of his at the Washington Post had just called him with the news. So then I had to believe it, and the next thing I know, there's a florist at the door with a big bunch of flowers, and the phone's ringing, and I'm on the phone, and my 8-year-old goes and answers the door to the florist and says, "Mum can't come now. She's really busy. She just got the Pulitzer prize." It was. Yeah. Anybody else, or shall we, we can talk more. I'll be there signing books. Oh, yes, one more. Yeah.
You're adept at both chronological narratives and the split time narratives, and I'm just wondering if you can talk a little bit about the difference in writing those two kinds of novels.
Oh, the split time narratives and the ones that
is going to be
take part. Yeah, so this one is structured very much like People of the Book in that there's this contemporary thread, but the historical spine as well. Except the difference is that the historical spine is one long story instead of a bunch of different stories. I really like working that way. It's a bit of a high wire act because, you're running the risk that one narrative will be way more compelling to the reader than the other ones. And I never go on Goodreads because people are very willing to tell you that in not very flattering language. I hated the contemporary thread. It sucked. So for self-preservation, I try and stay away from that. But no, what the tricky thing is trying to find where the connective tissue is that links the stories together. And you have to take that on trust because I start off not knowing what that is. And it reveals itself as you get deeper and deeper into the story. And the other thing that I always do as a practice is I don't do the research up front. I let the story drive the train. So I start writing the story until I come to something I don't know. And then I go and find it out. And the reason I do that is because before I started my first historical novel, I was lucky enough to meet Charles Frazier, who wrote Cold Mountain, which is a book I admire immensely. And it took him forever to write that book because he used to get lost at the library and he would just research and he would find these interesting threads and he would follow them. And he was 7 years into this when his wife, who is an accountant, said, "Chuck, no more library for you. You're going to sit down and you're going to write. And when you have 3 things that you can show me on a piece of paper that you need to know, you may go to the library." and find those 3 things. And then you have to come back home and write. And so that's how he got his book finished. And so I thought, I'm going to take that advice from the get-go and let the novel tell me the 3 things that I need, go find them and come back and write some more. So that's how we do it. All right. Well, thank you very much.